Distinguished colleagues, respected elders, honored guests and friends, Raranim and Tiroa Vivenisin, Kirisotapur Redigarai. I bring warm greetings from Micronesia to you all. It is indeed a privilege to speak to you today at this important gathering hosted by the University of the Balearic Islands. Although I am not there with you in person, I hope that this digital recording would be sufficient. We are invited to think deeply about oceans, not merely as spaces of inquiry, but as spaces of life, relation, and responsibility. I come to you from Rhode in the Federated States of Micronesia, a place where the ocean is not a boundary, but a connective tissue, not a resource, but a relative, not an object of governance, but a subject that governs us in return. Today I want to speak about relational justices and ocean sovereignty, and how Indigenous Pacific, or rather Oceanian, frameworks offer not only critique, but direction, especially in this time of climate crisis and intensifying geopolitical competition across our ocean. We live in a moment defined by overlapping crises: ecological collapse, climate change, and geopolitical tension. These are especially visible in the Pacific, or more properly in the Oceania. Even more proper in my mother tongue, Fosun Chuk. The sea is Matau, a region that is often narrated by Indigenous actors as vast, remote, and empty, yet is increasingly central to global strategy. I want to suggest that beneath these crises, though, lies a deeper problem, if you will, a crisis of reduction. We have inherited not only knowledge, but we have inherited systems of knowledge and governance that reduce the ocean into categories that are legible to institutions, but alien to lived realities. This is not a new critique. Many, including Escobar and Latour, have long argued that modern systems fragment worlds into objects of management. Others remind us that we treat as objective facts, what we treat as objective facts are always embedded in networks of relationship. So I propose that Indigenous relationalities provide resources for us to begin countering this crisis of reduction at a fundamental level. Indigeneity requires an ethic of relationality that moves us beyond a logic that reduces nature to data and currencies, so that in such orientations of epistemology and naming, life forms of the ocean, such as tuna, for example, lose their natural life and are sort of re-biologized as economic currencies to, say, the technocrat, and as data to the scientist, and as political and strategic chess pieces by the geopolitician. In this process, something profound is lost, not only their nature and their biology and their ecological complexity, but what is also lost is ethical obligation. In a reductionist ontology, then, the ocean is reduced to a site of extraction rather than relation. Life forms are, in this sense, reduced to stock units rather than kin, and governance becomes management rather than responsibility. In many Oceanian island societies, including my own context in Chuk, the ocean is understood through relational ontologies, which are mobilized and facilitated through vernacular and language. For instance, the contested name Pacific is not problematic in and of itself, but the system of knowledge in which this name is embedded points to the fact that this label, imposed by Western colonial actors, is rooted in a narrative that casts this vast life-filled space as a place of conquest, reinforcing the idea that It is vast, remote, and empty. The name Pacific invokes legacies and memories of armed conflict, World War II, nuclear bomb testings, destructive overfishing, mindless pollution, and chronic violence. We, the people who live here, are cast as unfortunate casualties of military strategy, as acceptable externalities of economic computations and managed liabilities within big corporate industries such as fisheries and deep seabed mining. In stark contrast, Indigenous scholars in the region have suggested that the name Oceania carries with it a relational framework that honors the seascape as a place of connection and relationships between people and place, between humans and non-humans, between the living and the ancestral. This aligns with broader Indigenous scholarship. Sean Wilson, for example, reminds us that knowledge is relational, that to know something is to be accountable to it. Linda Tuhiwai Smith similarly challenges research traditions that extract knowledge but without responsibility. In my Indigenous tongue, concepts embedded in Indigenous vernacular, what I am exploring in my own research through Fosun Chuk, the language of Chuk, encode these relationships. Knowledge then is not abstracted, it is lived, practiced, and inherited. So to know the ocean is not simply to measure it, but to be accountable to it. This is what I mean by relational justice. So relational justice in this sense is not only about fairness in distribution. It's about the integrity of relationships, so that it asks questions like, what does it mean to be in right relation with the ocean? What obligations do we carry toward marine life, not as resources, but as co-inhabitants? And how do systems of governance uphold or violate these relationships? When we speak of ocean sovereignty, the dominant frame is often territorial, defined by exclusive economic zones, maritime boundaries, and state jurisdiction. But Indigenous Oceanian frameworks compel us to think differently. Ocean sovereignty is not only about control over space, it is about responsibility within relationships. For many Oceanian communities, sovereignty is exercised not through domination, but through stewardship. It is enacted through practices such as fishing or navigation, ceremony, that sustain both people and ecosystems. This stands in tension with contemporary governance regimes that prioritize extraction, commodification, and economic optimization. When nature becomes primarily an economic asset, it's priced, traded, and negotiated in distant markets, we risk severing it from the relational contexts that have sustained it for generations. So, in terms of things like climate change, um, it just serves to intensify these tensions. For Pacific Island countries or Oceanian countries, climate change is not an abstract future. It is a lived present. Sea level rise, coastal erosion, and ecosystem shifts are already reshaping livelihoods and landscapes or seascapes. But climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is a justice issue. It raises fundamental questions about who bears responsibility, whose knowledge counts, and whose futures are being secured. At the same time, the Pacific is becoming a site of renewed geopolitical interest. Strategic competition, for example, between the US and China is increasingly played out across our region. The war machine and military complex is enabled fundamentally by the way we name and treat spaces and by how we define our relationships with the ocean. Because militarism is rooted and fertilized in the soil of language. It is no wonder the eradication of indigenous languages has always been a primary tool of the colonizer. With this framework, we assert that naming, language, and the classification of space are deeply embedded within the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Competing terms such as Israel, Palestine, occupied territories, disputed land, Judea and Samaria, and even the naming of cities and neighborhoods reflect not just geography, but claims to history, legitimacy, sovereignty, and identity. Language functions here as a political instrument. It frames international perception, shapes, legal arguments, and conditions what forms of violence are seen as permissible or condemnable. In this sense, the conflict is not only territorial, but also epistemic, fought through narratives and discursive power. Within this contested terrain of meaning, many scholars, legal experts, and human rights organizations argue that the scale and nature of violence inflicted on Palestinians constitute genocide, a characterization that itself becomes part of the struggle over language recognition and accountability. So, infrastructure projects, for example, security agreements, and development initiatives are often framed in language of opportunity, but they also carry risks of dependency, external control, and of further marginalization of indigenous voices. In this context, ocean sovereignty is inseparable from political sovereignty, and relational justice demands that Oceania peoples are not merely stakeholders when we talk about Oceania and make decisions, but that they are actual decision makers. So, what might it look like to indigenous Oceanian frameworks if we take them seriously? First, it requires a shift in epistemology. We must move beyond the assumption that valid knowledge is only that which can be quantified, modeled, or monetized. Indigenous knowledge systems are not supplementary, they are foundational. Second, it requires a shift in governance. Rather than managing resources, governance must cultivate relationships. This means recognizing customary marine tenure, supporting community-based management, and embedding ethical obligations into policy. Third, it requires a shift in values, shifting from extraction to care, from efficiency to reciprocity, from control to responsibility. These are not romantic ideals. These are practical necessities for sustaining ocean ecosystems in the long term. So while my reflections are grounded in the Pacific, the implications are global. The crises we face, climate change, biodiversity loss, geopolitical instability, cannot be resolved within the same frameworks that produce them. Relational justice offers an alternative. It invites us to reimagine our place in the world, not as masters of nature, but as participants in a web of relationships. It challenges us to ask not only what we can take from the ocean, but what we owe to it. And it reminds us that sovereignty at its deepest level is not about domination, but about responsibility. So let me close with this. Legal frameworks are essential for the governance of the ocean, but indigenous relationalities are critical for reframing, and I would like to say rebiologizing ocean life within an ethic of care and responsibility, an orientation that is indispensable for the protection of life and the oceans. We must move beyond legality to justice, beyond mechanistic consequences to meaning, reconciliation, and relationship building, beyond extraction to reciprocity, and beyond abstraction to lived relational accountability with the ocean as a source of life. The future of the ocean will not be determined solely in conference rooms, policy documents, or scientific models. It will be shaped by the relationships we choose to uphold. If we continue to reduce the ocean to data, currency, and strategy, we will reproduce the very crises we seek to solve. But if we reorient ourselves toward relationality, toward justice, toward responsibility, we may yet find another path. A path where the ocean is not a frontier to be conquered, but a relative to be honored. A path where indigenous knowledge is not marginalized, but centered. A path where sovereignty is exercised not through control, but through care and ethical stewardship. In Oceania, we often say that we do not inherit the ocean from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. The question before us is whether we will return it with integrity. Giriso Japur, and thank you.